All right, we're going to kick off this installment, I guess, of the Dev Book Club. We're going over Implementing Domain-Driven Design, Chapter 12, which is about repositories tonight. I am joined by Jeremy Cook, and hopefully some more stragglers who will be joining us later, but for present time, it's nice to have you on, Jeremy.
Nice to be here.
All right, so repositories. I really liked this chapter. I think
Me too.
it was very in depth. I think for what I was expecting of coverage of repositories, and of course it was like 80 pages or something ridiculous. But I thought it did a good job of going through and really explaining the goals of a repository, and then also it did two contrasting implementations to kind of show you, okay, here's what happens if you are working in a certain set of parameters where you've got a database abstraction or something that can handle a certain functionality versus, and then here's what you do if you don't. So basically it's talking about, can your abstraction handle essentially auto-saving, like so, or kind of saving under the hood versus explicitly. So I thought that was pretty cool. Like I really liked that contrast.
Yeah. No, I completely agree. And I found for me the examples towards the end probably got a little bit long and involved, but I guess you had to fill out the 80 pages and somehow.
Yeah, that's true. I think my favorite thing out of the entire chapter, I'm trying to find it in here, so forgive me a second. It was right before he was talking about the idea of adding other methods, or like other behaviors onto your repository, which I think is something that I really struggled with at first. When I was first trying out a repository, I was like, yeah, this should be pretty simple. Like I just have this object where I add things and I take them out and then they exist. And so to me, I think my original struggle was I was trying to implement it as a DAO. Like I was kind of replacing it very similarly to what he was talking about when he did go through the whole section on a repository is not a DAO, or like contrasting it with the concept of DAOs. And I was taking that, I guess that pattern that I was accustomed to already and trying to be like, well, a repository just replaces it, so it should kind of act similarly. So I ended up, I will admit this, but my first time trying to use this pattern, I ended up with a repository for every single database table, essentially. Like every concept I had a repository, even if it wasn't, really an aggregate at all. So I was, I would basically find, let's use a basic example of like a product or something, or a customer, and then inside the customer repository I'd be like, oh, all right, well I also need to get their orders, so let me use the order repository to find orders by this customer or whatever. So I had this huge chain of repository calls just to build up what is actually an aggregate. And so just his talking about that and adding separate behaviors for things like filtering by certain criteria, and you only want to get things that are actually part of the aggregate, so you want to deal with it, but limiting it and really thinking about, and this kind of struck home with me, like really thinking about what you're doing and only providing access through a repository in that manner if you can navigate there through the aggregate itself. So I thought that was something that was really enlightening in this chapter for me, was just, don't use the repository as a crutch to get around poor aggregate design. I guess that's kind of what I took away.
So I think in that instance, for example, if you're talking about customers and orders, you might have let me get this right, an order repository, and you would pass it to customer and say find orders for customer, and that will be a valid use case. Or the other one would be to find the customer and then get the list of products, or the list of orders, from that customer, and then filter that based on some criteria. But I take entirely what you mean. I think the thing for me that really helped clear that concept up was So I highlighted a quote from close to the beginning of the chapter, and it said, for each type of object that needs global access, create an object that can provide the illusion of an in-memory collection of, and I've lost, there it goes, of all objects of that type. So, and I think that comes from the Eric Evans book, but that for me was quite an illuminating one. It's similar to the way I've used repositories in the past, but just, this idea that the repository creates this illusion that what you're doing is fetching a bunch of objects out of memory. I quite liked.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think that's kind of one of the things that drew me to interacting with or repositories originally. Like, I think I probably read about these prior to even being exposed to DDD in any way, and I really appreciated the kind of the abstraction idea, like the idea where I don't have to care. I don't have like a method on my order that says, as SQL, and then, I pass it some parameters or whatever, and, I've seen that done before, and I probably have done this before in the past, but just kind of taking a step back and saying, I don't actually care where this comes from. I just want to pretend like I just asked for this object and that I always had a reference to it for all eternity. And I think that was something that drew me to this as something that was very powerful, because it's like, hey, I've now got this abstraction that I can do some really cool things with, like updating things in place and dealing with changes over a longer period of time or whatever. I can deal with that internally and kind of expose it as, hey, this is just something that you had access to. Like it wasn't, there was no database required kind of concept.
Yeah. So a question that came to my mind, again looking at another quote that I highlighted, and it says, strictly speaking, only aggregates have repositories. So we're talking about just now customers and orders. In that sense, the orders are the aggregate. Customers an aggregate root. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think so, but I think an order could also be an aggregate, right?
Sure. But the at the root of it is the customer. But then that kind of, looking at this again, the question that comes to my mind is, in that case, is how do you deal with customers? How do you load a customer object? So the use of repositories I'm familiar with is through Docker and ORM, in which case all querying for objects is done through repository classes. Whether or not that object sits at the top of the hierarchy or is an aggregate root or is an aggregate object itself.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know.
I'm not sure either.
It's, I've always taken it to be, I guess for me, I've always implemented just, kind of following that guideline of anytime you're dealing with an aggregate, you can have a repository. Like I don't know, in this particular case, I would probably have two repositories. Like I have a custom repository and an order repository, and use them for different things. Like, I guess it would depend on in my model or in my usage. Would I ever access orders outside of, or would I, does an order kind of stand outside of a user? And I'd use that to help me figure out, okay, is this something that I would create a repository? Like, that's kind of how I've always distinguished between whether I would create some sort of mechanism, even if we weren't talking DDD, but just I would say, do I need to use this outside of its aggregate or its container, essentially?
Sure.
Do I ever need to get this particular thing? And then that's where I would create a second repository. But of course, you could think about that in terms of the thing we were just talking about, where it doesn't necessarily have to mean that orders gets a repository, but just that you can access orders directly through the customer repository. If that is truly the relationship, then, but you need to get orders at a certain point related to a customer. So if the only way to think about an order is through a customer, but there are situations where you would just want to pull back a group of orders or a single order by some criteria or something, that could go through your customer aggregate, right? Or your customer repository. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, it does. And I mean, another way of doing it is that you load the customer, which then has its aggregate of the orders, and then you could supply filtering methods on the aggregate itself,
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
which is Yeah, I mean, I've done this a lot of different ways. It's interesting reading this because it kind of goes back to work I did in my previous job, and so doctrine gives you a really nice syntax for building partial queries against aggregates. So you can retrieve an aggregate, you can build a query, and then you can tell the aggregate to return instances of the aggregate collection that matched the criteria you're passing. Um, so that was actually quite powerful. In this instance, you would get the order, you would then get the customer, then you would get the orders, and then you would pass in this query that says, filter this down to the orders that match these criteria,
Hmm.
which is another way of doing it. Performance-wise, I'm not sure what it would be like, but
Yeah, I think he actually addressed that concern in this chapter. He was talking about when you would expose kind of these alternate methods for filtering down
mm,
based on the customer, and uh, I think what he said was uh, you could provide kind of the public interface for it, but that should only be done or you should be cautious or be don't be liberal, kind of be conservative with your application of this concept.
yeah,
Only in situations where it would be a performance uh, related concern. So if you know, I guess if you've got people who are ordering hundreds of times or thousands of times, then
yeah,
it would be painful. Then that's when you would provide that filtering method publicly.
sure.
But of course, the line gets a little blurry when you're relying on uh, ORMs, like ORM's niceties that they provide. Like it gets a little blurry, I guess. To me, it's just there's
I,
like at that point you're
yeah.
yeah.
I also like, I think you mentioned this earlier as well, the idea that he talks about two kinds of repositories, the collection-oriented and the persistence-oriented.
Hmm.
But it seems like an interesting challenge if you're going to go collection-oriented as to how to abstract away, even to users of your code, the fact that there is a persistence there underneath it, that you're performing an action against this repository, and just under the hood, it's just magically saving and retrieving the data. It's
Yeah,
quite an
I
interesting idea.
I will certainly admit that I have tried to go collection oriented before and really just hide it away, but I have never been able to actually do that. So I've always ended up even in situations where I was using something that seemed like it could abstract it, I have not been able to. So I've always kind of favored the
That's interesting. So, what challenges did you really feel you ran into with that? Trying to take that approach.
um, yeah, just in general I guess the mechanism of you add something to repository and then what happens to it, like how does it get from hey I've just added this to it's persisted, like just the mechanics of it have never really shown themselves to me of how I can actually achieve that concept of just making it implicit save. I've always had to explicitly figure out a way to actually write it. Like I don't know, like I can't, I haven't done this in a while, so I can't really think of any specific examples. But it seemed to always be centered around, I'm trying to uh, create these objects um, or deal with them in that manner, and it's just always been a problem. So it could entirely have been related to how I was doing it or how I was creating the objects originally, but just I've never been able to figure out the mechanics of adding it, removing it, and stuff like that, and just keeping it all hidden.
See that it almost seems to me to almost be more of a question of semantics more than a meaningful difference. I mean, it's whether you call it add order to customer or whether you call it order repository save and save order. It's a similar thing under the hood, right?
Yeah, I think so, but you know, to me, honestly, I think add add order to a customer, I think is more expressive as to what's going on. Like
Sure.
save is basically just saying, hey, I want to write this somewhere. It doesn't really tell you what is going on. So to me, it's better to explicitly say, add this order or that sort of thing. But
See, am I missing something? I'm just trying to cast my mind back to when I read this. Am I missing something about the differences between collection and persistence oriented? Because it seems to me that the first example is collection oriented. You're basically saying add this order to the customer, and you don't you're effectively saying you don't care how it's persisted. You just expect that when you've added this order to the customer, it's just going to be there whenever you request it. The second one, yeah, I can't remember enough about the difference between the collection and the persistence oriented at this point. But can you remember off the top of your head what the essential difference was?
Um, I believe it had to do with how the actual underlying persistence mechanism dealt with uh, dealt with change management would be the difference. So like collection oriented, I think is, or I guess that's kind of the deciding factor. I can't. I'm trying to figure it out really quickly, but
Yeah, likewise.
I don't really. I don't remember how he described the difference. Yeah, I don't know. It's I don't
Oh,
know.
takeaways for collection-oriented repositories. It says this, and a repository should mimic a set collection. Whatever the backing implementation with a specific persistence mechanism, you must not allow instances of the same object to be added twice.
Yeah.
Also, when retrieving objects from a repository and modifying them, you don't need to resave them to the repository. You don't need to resave them. Okay.
Yeah, because that's kind of the implicit uh, the ability for your persistence mechanism to track changes that happen. Like you're saying, you have this object, you make a modification, and then it's already persisted for you. Like it's in the collection, so there's no reason to mess with it. That's the stuff that I've never been able to figure out.
That makes sense. Okay, so it just automatically persists itself every time you make an edit to it. Okay.
Yeah, which to me kind of seems um, counter to the idea. It
Yes.
seems to me like that's bringing the persistence concern into your domain objects even. So it seems rather, foolish to me. But
Yeah. How would you even do that?
I, like I said, I've never been able to accomplish it. So my answer is I wouldn't,
Hmm.
or I haven't, I guess.
The other one that seems tricky with that one is that you don't end up with a unit of work. You end up with all of these database calls happening, piecemeal fashion as you access and change individual
Hmm.
records. Unless there's some way you can group all of that data.
Yeah, which I'm assuming that certain ORMs, probably in other languages, deal with that and kind of hide that that problem from you. Like I would imagine that they
Yeah.
collect stuff together and do it internally, but I don't know. I've never been able to do it, and I don't know of a PHP ORM that can handle that. So
No, me neither. Interesting.
yeah. And then I think another thing that I really liked about this chapter was his explicit focus on testing.
Hmm.
Like, I mean, I know it sounds really simple, but I did like that he talked about concerns with testing repositories because I've answered this question before for people, and it was focused around, okay, so I've written this repository. How do I actually test it? Because you often end up with some sort of interface or something, and you're like, all right, so I've got this implementation that deals with doctrine. So how do I test that? Because now I've got to mock out doctrine or whatever, and the answer in the book is no, you don't. Like the answer in the book is essentially if you're testing your production implementation of a repository, you have to use your production implementation of a repository.
Yeah.
So in order to test it, you are going to be hitting your database for the test of the actual repository. Testing the use of your repository, you should follow your standard practices, whether it's mocking or stubbing or creating your own stub or whatever, like whatever your particular preference is. I thought it was really nice of him to cover that, since I know it's a topic that comes up a lot, and like I said, I personally have been asked several times, well, how do you do this? Because testing with the database is bad. It's like, well, this is code that interacts with your persistence layer in some way. So
It's more an integration test rather than a unit test at that
Yeah,
point.
exactly. This is the point where you would do an integration test.
Yeah,
You're now integrating, and I don't know. I think that was a good summary to me
yeah, I agree.
in this chapter.
Yeah, yeah. I also like. I mean, I like the discussion of uh, the persistence-oriented repository and things like the change tracking and the identity map and the unit of work and keeping track of those things as well. It was nice to hear. Those are all concepts I've come across in the past, and it was nice to hear again that he was to have that fuller discussion to get a bit more understanding of the use cases behind that.
Yeah.
So I'm just reading a comment here from Dustin. Collection-based repositories can be sort of pulled off through event sourcing. Yeah, not the same as what the book suggests, but the idea is that you have either a spy or an observer that watches an aggregate route for when domain events are emitted. That's an interesting idea. And auto-commits them to the event store and broadcast projections. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I can see that working, and that's probably
Yeah.
why I've never delved into event sourcing. So
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
his
Yeah.
last comment is particularly interesting.
A lot of infrastructure that doesn't buy you much.
Yeah.
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 Yeah. I mean, I like the idea of the the unit of work, and you build up that unit of work, and then you finally you explicitly say save it, and it
Flush
all
this, yeah.
happens in that one sense there. But yeah, I wonder. It's an interesting idea.
I think they're similar concepts, really.
Yeah.
Just kind of pushed off one in one direction and one the other. So
I wonder if the idea of the collection-oriented repository is almost, for want of a better way of putting it, purer DDD, because it really just takes you away completely from the persistence layer. You have no concern with that at all, right? You have the fullest illusion that all you're doing is working with objects in memory.
yeah, I would say it is probably the pure form, but I don't know. Like to me, it's if you're not already down that path, I kind of see it as being a like just as Dustin is saying, like a lot of work that gains you little. If your only reason for going down that path is so you can use a collection oriented repository, then I would say no.
Yeah, it's almost a case of we've chosen the really cool tools because they're really cool. It's not-
Yeah. I'm gonna do this before I die.
That's right.
Yeah.
All right. What else did I have out of this?
I don't know. That was kind of the bulk of it that I found particularly useful out of this chapter.
I'm just looking through the various things I highlighted. Hmm. Incidentally, what do you think of the cowboy logic stuff that keeps popping up in all these chapters? I've just spotted that.
I think I chuckled at one of them in this chapter. So
Really?
yeah, well, just I chuckled at it because they're I don't want to say dumb, but they're corny enough to be funny depending on my mood, right? Like it's just I don't know.
Yeah.
Like this one that says, when my dog got a case of worms, the veterinarian prescribed some repositories.
Yeah.
And I was like, that's probably the stupidest joke I've heard all day, but it's kind of the right humor for this book, I think.
Yeah. When I said really, I didn't mean I wasn't implying that I found it crazy that you would actually laugh at one of the jokes in the book, but I just I haven't actually found one yet that I've particularly enjoyed, but. Maybe it's cultural.
I think
Two men in bowler hats standing on a street corner talking in London or something. I don't know.
I think enjoyment is the wrong word.
Okay.
It's enjoyment as the same kind of enjoyment you get from when you find yourself on the weird part of the internet, and you're like, how did I even get here? That's the kind of enjoyment that I take away from the cowboy logic.
Yeah. One note I made, and again, this is just I just highlighted a bunch of stuff I found interesting as I went through it. So I like we talk about add and remove methods and that sort of stuff, and about how a lot of time people will make these methods answer true, and Well, firstly, he says that his reasoning is that he doesn't like that much, but because answering true doesn't necessarily indicate instantly that success has happened.
Hmm.
So that's a good point in itself. But it's something I've been thinking more and more about recently. Is that um, when is it appropriate to just return null, or when is it appropriate to not return anything at all? As opposed to just returning true just because you want to signal that something has happened successfully. You
Yeah,
know?
I think overall people get kind of wrapped up in
Yeah.
oh well, I can return something, so I might as well figure out something I should return from this.
Yes.
And I think that's often where people end up with, well, Boolean is a popular one, and then fluent interface is another very popular one because it's like, I don't really know what this method should return, therefore I will return a reference to this, and then someone could do whatever they want with this. And I think it's one of those things in programming where you kind of learn over time to really think about what you're exposing and why. And if you don't have a good reason, it's perfectly acceptable to return nothing at all. But that's just me.
Yeah, the fluent interface one is interesting to me as well because I used to do a lot of it, um, and then I heard Guillermo Blanco talking about object calisthenics, and one of his things was never do fluent interfaces, and he went into various reasons why that you can't guarantee that unless you can explicitly guarantee that this method call is always going to return an instance of this on every single use case, and then by the time you've chained them together, it makes error tracking harder and all this sort of stuff.
Yeah, I think it's got a very limited use case. Like large configuration type objects, like if you've just got an object where you're just like configuring something, I can kind of see it being useful, but it's very, very like the way I often see people using it is, they have a bunch of public setters exposed for every property they have. So they're like, okay, cool. So I've got a new person, and now
Yeah.
person set name, person do this, person do that, and I'm like, all of that stuff is all required for your object to be valid. So why is it not in the constructor? Like,
And
why
I've done
is
a
it
lot of
not?
that in the past, and I'll hold up my hand and admit to that. But then, having read this book, in particular, and considered more about, the actual the main modeling of the real world concepts, that's it's probably something I wouldn't do a lot of in the future.
Yeah. So like, instead of a set name setter, you have a change name if that's something that happens, method that does something and isn't part of your object setup. So just yeah, I think it's a natural progression that everyone goes through. I've totally had probably 90% of objects that I've written in certain applications that are fluent interface with tons of setters and stuff, and then I slowly learned over time, hey, this is probably not
Yeah.
that brilliant of an idea.
And then I think as well the other interesting one that moves beyond using the fluent interface is using small types, using value objects to encapsulate values. So I think we've all done it, like in the class of person. We've done new person, set first name, set last name, set
Yeah.
age, set middle initial, this sort of stuff. Whereas if you encapsulate those types, as a value object for first name, the last name, all that sort of stuff, then there's far less chance that you'll get confused in a constructor and end up passing the wrong argument into the wrong place.
Yeah, I think value objects is something that I've really taken an interest to, especially just because I've run into lots of debugging over the years where it's because there's three things that are kind of required to be set or whatever, and someone has passed in two of them in a certain configuration, and then the third one in something that you weren't expecting or whatever. And it's like, wait, you shouldn't have been able to do that. And then it's just it's a bug. Now you got to track this down. So I've definitely come to embrace the concept of really understanding what values I have and how they're related, and then grouping them into objects.
Justin has just pointed out that I talk very fast, apparently.
I'm in the southeast. You got to talk real slow, long, drawn
I'm
out.
sorry. I always like to say that it's because my brain works so fast, but that's a complete lie.
So we were actually having a discussion at work today. We're taking a legacy app and trying to apply DUD in targeted spots in it. And one of the problems we're running into is we've come up with this nice domain model that validates everything, and the model before, well, there simply wasn't one. So there's data in the database that when we try to pull it through a repository and bring up the model, there's not enough data to make a consistent model. So we were talking about today in, say it's a user, student, whatever, we're pulling through this repository. If we're expecting that they don't exist, we'll return null. If we don't find one, and we're talking about exceptions we would throw if to highlight the fact that it does not have enough data to meet the minimum requirements or minimum dependencies of a student. But whether you returning null to return null, I agree with you. I think is kind of or returning something just to return it's kind of a poor choice. But you want to be consistent across the code base. So like we're looking at this one part of the application, and what we don't want to have is certain repositories returning null, certain repositories throwing exceptions when models don't exist, and stuff like that, because it starts to feel weird. You don't know what to expect. Yeah, I don't know.
So Doctrine does this, interestingly. I mean, I casted my mind back a year since I've worked with Doctrine or so, but Doctrine repositories have, I'm trying to think if this is the repository. Yeah, no, this is the case. So they will have a find one by or find one by ID, for example. And if it doesn't find an object with an ID, with the parameter you've passed, it throws an exception. I forget exactly of what type. But there's a separate method, which is find one or null. So there is a way that you can consistently have the two behaviors, if you like, and then it's up to the where the code is called, you know, how the user wants to then use the repository to do that. That may not, I don't know if that answers your question. I mean, I'm just thinking it through as I'm outlining this. It makes the code more consistent.
The whole process I was going through than a question, and I think the important thing is picking something and going with it.
Yeah. At
least in one portion of the code base. Be consistent in these little isolated contexts, but.
Or would you want to? I'm just even thinking about that. Would you want to? If you're building from scratch, you would probably want to have the consistency across every single domain in your application. I'm assuming.
Right. Yeah. Ideally.
Yeah.
But you end up making these weird trade-offs when you try to, shove an existing legacy application into something like this. There's going to be weird issues.
Cool.
Yeah, it is always interesting. I talked about the idea of null and in a talk I gave on refactoring, and I debated whether I was going to even bring it up or not because it's kind of a difficult subject. Like it's a talk in and of itself. But yeah, I think that's always interesting. People, the idea of returning null seems like it's okay in every situation, and I think that's totally wrong. Like the problem with returning null from places where you're expecting to get back an object. So like in this case, you're asking for a specific user or a specific student or whatever, and you get back null. All that means is every place you use whatever class you're asking for or you're asking to give you a user, every time you use that method, you have to do a null check.
Yeah.
Every single place you have to do that, and so like that's something I always find interesting that people are okay with that concept. Because I think null and, if you go talk to Java programmers, null pointer exceptions, and that's probably like the most common bug is people are expecting something and they got back a null because somebody didn't want to think about what should actually happen here.
Right.
So, yeah, I think it is definitely a good point, and especially in your case.
That's the thing is, like, if I was working in Java and I referenced a hash map by a string that didn't exist, it would throw an exception.
Mm-hmm.
It would never return me null.
Yeah.
I think the more I think about it, I'm more just go with the exceptions and that be the case. You start getting into the argument of, expected behavior that isn't ideal versus truly exceptional behavior. And people arguing back and forth over that, but I don't know. That's one of those things. It's like when you write it, you're sending a message to future developers. So you're saying it's okay, it's expected that you're going to check null out of this repository until the end of time, or until someone comes along and refactors.
It's not expected; it's required.
Right. Yeah.
The best one I heard of thinking about this recently was, so I was part of an interview panel, and the candidate was talking about this, and he was talking about how in databases, null has an actual meaning. The concept of the null in a database table is absence of a value. Whereas in programming, in writing code, null can mean that you just haven't initialized the value, or it can mean, it can mean any of a number of things. You've created a variable, but you haven't assigned a value to it. It ends up with a value of null. So, given that null has an absence of a well-defined value in programming terms, it's almost better never to return a null. Was his argument anyway?
Yeah. I can see that. Of course, then you end up with the problem of, if you return nothing, then whatever you assign, you get null. So
yeah.
you kind of can't get around it. But yeah, I think
so that brings up an interesting point in a possible difference between collection-based repositories or persistence, is that in a collection-based repository, I would never really want to expect that I'd have a null come back, because that would mean in my repository of same aggregate type, there's a null in there randomly that is untyped and just chilling. Versus persistence, maybe it makes more sense there, since that is more of a persistence concept. I don't know, that's a stretch, but
yeah, to me, I would say I would never expect for a repository to give me a null if I ask it a question. Like, it can give me an empty set, it can give me, some sort of null object if that's appropriate for whatever I'm asking for, which is a very complicated and pattern that you probably shouldn't ever mention in a talk. Don't ask me how I know that. But it could return, something, but I would never expect for it to be like, I don't really know how to answer your question, therefore I give you back this value that means something and or nothing at the same time.
So if you were querying for a single object from a repository, if that object didn't exist, you'd always expect an exception to be thrown.
I probably would, yes.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me as well.
Yeah. So another thing I thought of was, given the existence of, I'm not a doctrine user, but you mentioned find by ID or find or null, that type of behavior. Pushing that behind a more domain-specific interface. Whether or not that was a good idea. So when you talk about some of the, there's an argument that the repositories interface should speak the language of the domain. Yeah. So if you have some specific collection you need to, or some complicated query, you have that method call on the repository. You want to be careful with how many of those you open up. The problem I've seen with that is if you don't have something to dry up code behind that interface, you end up with this gobbledygook of SQL crap to pull together this filtered collection of data, where you may lose the benefit of having a specification object that would clearly say this is a specification that maps entities that are stored, or aggregates that are stored elsewhere.
So to clarify in the case of doctrine, I mean the find one by and the find one on null methods are utility methods that are provided on repository for any entity that you create, and you're quite right in that they have no meaning in a specific domain. And I think they're more because obviously doctrine is a tool that's used for general use. It's not specifically designed as a DDD tool, I guess.
Right.
So we could argue whether or not that's good that doctrine has these methods, but it's kind of a fact of life that they're there and they're not going to go away, I'm assuming. But I quite agree that if you're using a tool like doctrine, or I'm assuming Hibernate probably has similar methods as well, that within a DDD concept, it's far more valuable to, saying find one by ID is like, is to come up with a method name and a method that more expressively
Right.
maps to the domain that you're modeling.
I'm explaining this point. I don't disagree with the find by IDs and stuff. And picking a specific object is probably a bad example, but let's say you were looking to filter an entire repository for maybe customers that meet some discount. You want to represent that discount as a specification. It's looking at it loads up a customer aggregate, looks at the orders they have out there, and for each order, there's some business rule that determines whether or not they've met some criteria. So one way you could do that is say, have a interface method on the repository that says, get me all customers that meet the discount criteria. And immediately in the implementation of that could be some, whether it's doctrine query language or however you want to implement and pull that together. If you go straight to the persistence behind the interface, if you're not documenting that well, someone coming into the code doesn't see. It's like implied, that business rule. You're implying the business rule in DQL versus expressing the business rule explicitly as its own separate object.
But is that really an issue, though, with DDD? Isn't part of the purpose of the repository to abstract it away so that to the user of the repository it just looks like you're just getting these objects out of memory? Right. So is that really a concern of the person who's using the repository? That inside the repository, it doesn't really matter whether it's implemented using SQL or DQL or Hibernate query language or semaphore for whatever the user cares. It's the fact is you're getting back a set of data that matches what you're asking for.
Right. I'm looking for. There's a specific example I remember seeing on the web that explains it a lot better than I am right now. What it all boils down to is there will be a general method on the repository that you hand a specification, and without any optimization, what would happen is it would load up the entire collection. It would do a find all, iterate over it, and then using the specification pattern, determine whether or not the specific aggregate matched a business rule. And if it did, it adds it to this temporary collection that it's going to return at the end of the call. Let me see if I can find it.
And you're saying that's bad, right?
No. What I think is bad is when those types of rules get shoved into SQL directly, and you end up with, let's say you had to order a T-shirt, a bottle, and something or other to meet some criteria, and you shove that rule down into SQL, and you're trying to make specific queries. You're stretching outside the bounds of the repository to try to make. I'm explaining this terribly. I might as well stop.
No, at all. I mean, I don't have a problem with that because for me, see, let me just find the quote again. I'm not sure if you were on, but at the beginning, for me, one of the key quotes of this chapter at the beginning. Sorry, I'm just flipping back through all the things that I highlighted. Here we go. Was this: for each type of object that needs global access, create an object that can provide the illusion of an in-memory collection of all objects of that type. So the fact that you can, inside the repository, I don't really care what's going on. If it's providing me the illusion that all of this stuff exists in memory, if it's using SQL to do that, that's absolutely fine with me. And I don't have a problem with, conceptually, I don't have a problem with, leveraging whatever the benefits of the specific persistence layer that the application is using to pull this stuff together as efficiently as possible. But it's really for the users of the domain.
Yeah. And that was the thing, is like, as far as the client shouldn't care. They're on the other side of the interface, and they really don't care how they're getting the data. But if you ever had a use case where you're halfway in between an event-sourced model and pulling data also from some Redis cache or something, and you need to be able to handle both, perhaps what would end up happening is you have to implement that business rule in a query language twice, rather than expressing it once in code as its own separate object specification, and then implementing each of those separately.
Okay.
So I linked in some slides.
Yeah, look at the...
To kind of go through the idea, and this is used in conjunction with a repository, not necessarily the responsibility of a repository, I guess. But I know in the Blue Book there's, and I don't have mine on me, there's an example. They use specifications as a example when he goes over repositories. I haven't gotten a whole lot of experience with it because for most of the applications or domains I'm in, I have not needed to do anything that a norm or a one-off query can do, and it seems clear enough. But it's an interesting idea. But
this example makes a lot of sense to me, though. So he has this concept that as you were saying, that the customer is a premium customer if they've ordered more than 3 times. Right. But he has a customer specification interface which specifies a single method is satisfied by, which you pass a customer to it, and it returns a Boolean value, true or false. And then he has a specific customer is premium, implementing the customer specification. And in that is satisfied method, he counts the number of orders from the order repository, and then returns if that is greater than or equal to 3. Seems to me to be a clear example. Yeah, and I take your point there. I mean, that's a nice clear-cut example. Is that the domain logic, is not how many times the customer's ordered. It's whether or not they've ordered more than 3 times.
Right.
So, but if I had some sort of complex, if I had a more complicated piece of domain logic that required that I would load, a whole bunch of aggregates and then filter those aggregates by various criteria to find the ones that existed, and I could do this all in memory, or I could do it in the persistence layer, and the persistence layer was going to be faster. Let's assume SQL. I wouldn't have too many qualms with going with the latter approach in that case.
Right. Yeah, and that would make sense.
Okay.
Okay, so let me see if I understand. The point that you're making is, if you have a repository and you've got a bunch of, let's say you have a whole bunch of methods like find premium customers or something like that, and then find whatever other, I don't know, but so let's say you have a repository that has find premium customers, and then inside that you're using your SQL statement or whatever to actually filter them. So you're hiding the business rules there, as opposed to what your preferred method would be to have a specific concrete specification that has the business rules inside of it. Is that your point?
Right. So you'd have, and here's where if it's a trivial example, none of this makes sense at all. If you're doing something more like what's going on in the slides, or anything more complicated than, like I said, trivial, it makes sense to represent that business rule as its own object that represents the concept of the rule. The implementation can still be calls to doctrine query language or SQL or whatever, and that's where you get into these specifications might have a as SQL or a as SQL or something like that. But you obviously wouldn't, if the only persistence you have is using doctrine or MySQL or whatever, you wouldn't put this abstraction in there for a simple rule that's not going to change.
Yeah. what I like about that approach as well, again, just looking at the slides, is you've created the business rule in the domain. Customer is premium, and you say, is this business rule satisfied by, and you pass a customer, which again seems to be a very expressive way of modeling that concept.
But you look at the message you're sending as far as the lines of code you're writing. The message is that the customer with 3 orders is premium is just the first one. There's going to be other implementations of that coming. Versus if it's a simple enough rule that's not going to change, you just write it in SQL whatever you want and implement. And you don't put in additional infrastructure layers of complexity.
Sure.
But yeah, it's definitely, I want to arrive or find an application of this, but I've not had to yet.
So I think he actually gives an example of this sort of in the slide deck. If you're following along at home, it's unbreakable domain models. Probably just Google that and you'll figure it out. It's on Speaker Deck. But he actually gives later on. I don't know what he has a method called find registered in year. So that would be an example of having, this is simple enough logic, so it doesn't really need a criteria or a specification of any sort. But yeah, I think what you're saying is totally valid. That you will keeping the business rules in a way that's easy to understand them, as opposed to making them specific to any particular persistence implementation is useful.
This also gets a lot more useful when you start looking at repositories that are sitting on top of event stores, and you start wanting to say, find me all users that added 3 items to their cart, removed 1, and then left the site all within 5 minutes. You'll have a use case specific way of pulling that off. That's what's presented to clients of the repository, but inside is a lot more complexity that is more suited to this type of specification pattern.
And interestingly enough, answering a question like that is a good way to drive people insane.
Yes.
Trying to figure out how to get those customers back. So, so there's that too. All right, cool. Anything else?
Just flipping through my notes if there's anything I picked up on.
Jeremy's all prepared with notes. I should really have notes too. That'd be.
I have a Kindle, and as I read, I just drag my finger across passages and mark them as highlighted. It's yeah.
Definitely seems like a good idea.
Yeah.
I highlighted just things I found interesting as I went through, and one of them was, again, something I've done is the concept that a repository can have a remove concept, but behind the scenes you're not actually removing it from the data source, you're just marking it as no longer available. So, yeah, I just mark that as interesting rather than being earth-shattering or anything like that.
I don't know. You just shattered my world. You can remove something without actually removing it. That's pretty intense.
Yeah. One thought I had with using repositories for testing is, have you ever considered using them for specific fixtures instead of actually loading fixtures for a particular test in your database, making a repository that represents that set of data, and then maybe sourcing it from something more suitable like a YAML file or whatever.
I suppose you could do that. That'd be an interesting way to set things up. Like you need to have a repository, or you need to have 5 customers or whatever with certain properties. So you just create an implementation of your repository that has those 5 in it or whatever. Is that what you're suggesting?
Yeah, it seems a little clunky.
Yeah,
I think it'd be cooler to have something like that. I could just dynamically set up scenarios and say, I'd like a customer repository that has 5 customers that have ordered between 1 or 5 items and have done this, that, and the other, and it just dynamically create the same set of data every time.
Yeah, it seems. So my big problem with that is that a test of a repository is really not that useful on its own, because the repository is an abstraction layer that's abstracting away the persistent source. So testing the code part of the repository on its own without the persistence layer backing it seems to me to be a little, not that useful necessarily. Now, I'm as soon as I've said that, I'm sure there are cases when it is useful. I can't happen to think of one at the moment. So I think, again, I don't know if you were on at the time, but Jeff and I discussed this a little bit earlier, and we were both of the opinion that at this point it becomes more of an integration test.
Well, that's what I was thinking, is for integration, not just testing the functionality of the repository, but definitely integration testing. Yeah, I wasn't there for that.
Okay.
Probably repeated from what y'all said.
And I think in the book he talks as well about. Well, maybe he doesn't talk. I was having a few other conversations about DDD over the last week or two, but whether there's a way that you can swap out the Oracle or MySQL or whatever database backend you're using and replace it with SQLite just for the purposes of the tests. If that's going to run faster for you.
I suppose you could. I've always found that to be problematic if you're trying to test the repository and putting it into a database. I've always found that the best way to test how your production code is going to behave is to test it in production. I'm just kidding, but in a way that kind of mimics what you would have in production. So if you aren't going to be using SQLite in production, then in my opinion, if you're testing whatever abstraction you have on top of your database, you should be testing it through and using whatever database engine you're going to use, just because you end up with weird quirks here and there if you don't.
Maybe it's just a matter of just identifying where you really need to have integration tests and accept that those are going to be slow, and just structure your test suites for what you really need, rather than just blanketly covering everything just to be, have 100% coverage.
Right.
It's generally my philosophy. I will say one thing: when you're dealing with legacy schemas, it is helpful to have tests that actually use the database every once in a while. Which, don't tell Grumpy that I said that, but we found some very weird cases where it's not necessarily a problem now, but for example, you have a database field which is a certain type, or like a tiny integer or something to that effect, and so it's got a certain range or whatever, and there are certain conditions where, depending on what framework or abstraction you're using, Rails, it might actually not obey, for example, the unsigned part of your database column. So a value that you thought could go up to, say, 256 or whatever only actually goes up to 127. So without the tests in place that were generating data up into that range, you might never know that your schema could actually fail depending on what framework you're using. So I will say that there is something to this whole concept of, if you want to test your database, you should probably test against your database instead of something else that mimics your database. That's all I'll say about that.
Well, that makes a lot of sense.
All right, so I think we've exhausted everything I have to say, I think, which is rare. So, anybody else? Everyone good?
I'm good.
Good. All right, well, thank you very much for joining tonight, guys. It's been a good discussion. Time to repository. We're almost done with this book. I noticed that. I think we have 2 chapters left, so I am compiling a list of suggestions that people have given me on next books, and then I'll be sending out some information, and we'll get a proper Twitter poll or whatever going, and I promise I will try to consider the votes. No, I'm just kidding. I will definitely consider the votes. So just look for that whenever it comes, and figure out what we can do. I need to check my schedule before I schedule the next one of these, just to make sure So I'll tweet and stuff about that. And see everyone next time.
All right.
Later.